Coming up on Arirang News, the Bank of Korea says the local economy contracted last year in the pandemic by 1%. Slightly better than expected, in fact, and a much better performance than many other developed economies that declined by double digits. South Korea announces plans to help kids start learning safely in the classroom again, while the main teachers continue to run classes online. Also for kids at home, their parents will get childcare support. And the South Korean government announces a plan to spend more than $150 million this year to help more businesses make use of the country's 5G network for things like self-driving cars and virtual reality. It's 5:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The third wave of COVID-19 in South Korea continues to subside despite the recent outbreak at a missionary school in the city of Daejeon. The government's expected to announce by the end of the week whether or not it will ease some of the current restrictions. Lee Kyung-eun has the latest.
More COVID-19 cases are being linked to the large-scale outbreak at a missionary school in South Korea's central city of Daejeon. There are now 171 patients connected with the virus at school run by the Christian missionary IM, and the number is expected to increase based on the latest analysis.
The first patients saw their symptoms emerge around January 17th and 19th. The infection rate stands at 80%. That means the facility has been exposed to the virus since the beginning of the program on January 4th.
Health authorities will investigate potential virus hotspots, such as restaurants and hair salons visited by patients. They're also monitoring any cross-city transmissions outside Daejeon. IM operates 22 similar facilities throughout the country, the list of which has been shared with local governments for inspections to be carried out. Despite fluctuations in daily figures, South Korea has, on the whole, managed to see a downward trend, with average transmission rates decreasing.
In the past week, the national reproduction rate of COVID-19 was at 0.82, staying below 1 for the third consecutive week.
On Tuesday, cases dropped to 354 from over 400 on Monday. However, the government remains cautious in easing the current restrictions. The upcoming Lunar New Year holiday is a major concern, with outbreaks possible from family gatherings. Discussions will continue until a decision is made later this week. Lee Kyung-eun, Arirang News.
And South Korea is looking to safely reopen its schools as soon as possible. So the Education Ministry's announced that it's going to hire support teachers to help kids in the classroom while the main teachers run the online classes. Also, parents with kids still learning from home will get more support in terms of childcare. Chae Won-jong has this report.
More elementary school students and students with disabilities in South Korea will be able to return to classrooms once the infection risk decreases. The Education Ministry announced on Tuesday that it is aiming to create a safe learning space at schools nationwide to eventually bring more children back to school.
The time when all students can go to school will be reviewed comprehensively and depends on the level of infection risk in the community and the nation's vaccine situation.
The ministry will assign nearly 2,000 contract teachers to help out students in the first, second, and third grades of elementary school. Those teachers will provide basic education support during in-person classes so that the main teacher can focus on delivering lessons to in-person and online students at the same time. To support parents with the childcare during the pandemic, care services such as after-school care for younger students will be available nationwide, covering more than 459,000 students. The ministry is also planning to hire professional counseling teachers who can visit schools frequently to provide emotional support for these younger students. As many classrooms operated remotely since last year, the government is trying to develop its online learning environment and using AI technology to help students with more individual learning in subjects such as math, Korean, and English starting this year. Chae Won-jong, Arirang News.
The number of coronavirus cases around the world, according to the tally by the website Worldometer, has now surpassed 100 million. The pandemic does seem to be slowing down in many countries that were major hotspots, like the UK and Japan, some of which are now rolling out their vaccines. Kim Yo-sun reports.
The global COVID-19 tally has surpassed 100 million, meaning the virus has infected around 1.3% of the world's population. According to Worldometer, a website that provides real-time statistics for the pandemic, global cases topped 100 million, while the accumulated global death toll stood at over 2.1 million as of Tuesday morning, Korea time. It took just 16 days for the overall caseload to jump from 90 million to 100 million. Despite the grim milestone, many countries are witnessing a drop in new cases. Britain, for example, reported over 22,000 new daily infections on Monday, its lowest number in several weeks.
Thankfully, there are early signs that the actions that we're taking are working. The rise in the number of cases is slowing and falling in some parts of the country, like London and Scotland. At the same time, the number of vaccinations is going up.
UK health authorities say lockdown rules will be reviewed in mid-February, the target date for the top priority groups to receive their first vaccine dose. At the same time, however, they also stressed that the pandemic continues to put immense strain on the nation's healthcare system. In Asia, Japan also reported a drop in daily infections on Monday to the 2,000 range for the first time since late December 2020. The downtrend comes more than 2 weeks into a COVID-19 state of emergency was issued in Tokyo and its surrounding prefectures. Kim Hyo-san, Arirang News.
South Korea's economy in 2020 shrank on year because of the pandemic, posting negative growth for the first time since the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s. The Bank of Korea points out, though, that the contraction was much smaller than other developed countries, but it's still cautious about the economy's prospects. Kim Jae-hee has the details.
South Korea saw its worst economic performance in more than 2 decades last year amid the COVID-19 pandemic. The Bank of Korea said on Tuesday that South Korea's GDP shrank 1% in 2020 compared to the previous year. This is the first time the nation's economy has seen an on-year contraction since it shrank 5.1% during the IMF crisis in 1998. Last year's on-quarter GDP shrank 1.3% in the first quarter and 3.2% in the second quarter. But GDP then grew in the third and fourth quarters by 2.1% and 1.1% respectively. A recovery in exports drove economic growth in the fourth quarter despite the third wave of the pandemic.
In the fourth quarter of last year, consumption and facilities investment contracted compared to the previous quarter, but exports continued to increase and construction investment expanded.
Private consumption contracted by 1.7% on quarter in the fourth quarter as spending on restaurants, accommodation, and transportation decreased. But exports were up by 5.2%, mainly from increased exports of semiconductors and chemical products. Looking over the whole of 2020, private consumption shrank 5%, marking the steepest fall since 1998. Exports dropped 2.5%, posting negative growth for the first time since 2009. The central bank says while South Korea's contraction was smaller than other countries, COVID-19 is still having an impact on the economy.
The third wave of the pandemic started to impact the domestic economy in November. Its influence was strongest in December, and it is still ongoing in January. The domestic economy is expected to grow around 3% this year, which is not enough to be seen as a fast recovery. With COVID-19 still ongoing, we need to be cautious about the economy's prospects.
Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi on Tuesday also pointed out the economic contraction is much smaller than in other developed countries and was hopeful the recovery in exports could lead to further economic recovery. But he also warned over sluggish consumption and stressed that the priority is containing the spread of COVID-19 for economic activities to get back to normal. Kim Jae-hee, Arirang News.
The South Korean government has reaffirmed its plan by 2024 to secure the country's own supplies of 100 kinds of materials, components, and equipment, for which South Korea has so far depended almost entirely on Japan. Last year, local supplies were secured for 3 of them, including photoresist, which is used in making semiconductors. Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi pledged Tuesday that this year they'll have it done for 20 more items. To do this, he said, the government will approve several projects to develop materials for electric vehicles and biomedical products. South Korea started its plan for self-sufficiency in these areas in 2019 after Japan cut off supplies in retaliation for a Seoul court ruling on compensating the Koreans Japan subjected to forced labor during World War II. The South Korean government is going to invest over $150 million this year to help businesses make more use of the country's 5G network in sectors like self-driving cars and virtual reality services. There's been rapid growth in 5G for retail users since the network's commercialization last year, but for businesses, the network is mostly still in testing. As part of the plan, the Ministry of Science and IT will work to establish 5G coverage nationwide by the end of 2022, which will include remote coastal and farm towns as well. This is in line with the government's Digital New Deal program, which aims to create more than 900,000 jobs by 2025. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good afternoon and thank you for coming on.
Good afternoon.
Well, stocks on New York were a bit mixed overnight ahead of earnings from major companies. The Nasdaq and the S&P rose to new highs, but the Dow was a little lower. A lot of analysts talking about signs of a bubble, but others saying the buying will continue. What's the story in the global markets?
Yes, if you look at the U.S. market, it was kind of mixed in a sense that it was showing a quite volatile session. But in any case, S&P 500 and Nasdaq booked the fresh highs as investors turned their attention to the earnings seasons, and the big tech reports are coming in a positive direction. On Monday, shares of Apple nudged up. The Nasdaq actually rose because of that with its quarterly numbers. On the fiscal side, the negotiation continues as the President Joe Biden tries to push through that $1.9 trillion U.S. dollar stimulus program that seems to be opposed by Republicans at the same time. On the pandemic front, hospitalization continues to trend down somewhat, but still quite painful, a very slow level. And vaccination seems to be rolling out as expected. All in all, if you look at the S&P 500, it jumped about 0.4%. Nasdaq was up about 0.7%. Looking at the valuations, the P multiple of S&P is running around 22 times. Historical record high number was 24 times, so therefore it is at very expensive territories. However, if you look at the historical 10 years average of interest rate, it is actually only a quarter of what used to be. So therefore, the P multiple expansion could happen even further. All in all, we think that the valuation being expensive is not a major issue at the current point in time. More important factor is the liquidity that you are seeing in the market, that M1 and M2 are growing at exponential level. We are looking at 72.3% year-on-year growth rate of M1, and for M2, it is rising at 27.3%.
Now today, the Korean market sharply lower the Kospi by more than 2%. The Kosdaq with its tech stocks did break through 2,000 points for the first time in more than 20 years, since the dot-com boom, basically. What do you see happening in the local markets?
Yes, I think that the Korean market seems to be quite volatile, given the fact that it has been one of the best performing market in the world, followed by actually the number one was the Vietnam market, and Korea was somewhere around number 2, number 3 performance so far in the last 3 weeks or so. It has hit the over 3,200 level territories, but today it tanked by about 2%. I think that the people are concerned about the issues of short selling ban not removed going forward, that the regulatory environment is not necessary for positive direction. All in all, we've been saying that the Korean market needs to have risk premium reduced, and the issues was related to North Korea issues or regulatory issues or dividend payout issues or corporate governance issues. All in all, that seems to be actually improving. But still, nevertheless, right now, the regulatory environment is not necessarily that positive for the overall market condition in the long term. But in the short term, if short selling ban continues, then the domestic investors, the retail investors will continue to drive up the market. Today, if you look at it, the foreign investors and the institutional investors sold 4.2 trillion won of equity Korea, and retail investors bought all that back. So clearly there's a huge liquidity of retail investors buying the Korean market. If that kind of trend continues, we think that the market can go up even higher over the next several months.
Yeah, impressive volume today, Mr. Yu. Well, we're up against the clock, so we're going to have to leave it there for today and catch up later in the week. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.